The daguerreotype burned in my hands. My face, my scar, but dated 1924. My brother Thomas slammed the attic door shut behind me, his voice a snarl. "Give me the legacy plates." The brass lamp was my only weapon as his fingers closed around my throat. The ledger in my pocket held the truth. My life was a lie, and the next 30 seconds would decide if I escaped or became another name on the list of vessels. The stairs groaned under his weight. I swung. Dust motes danced in the beam of Elias's flashlight, settling onto the cracked leather of his grandfather's trunk. He pulled a heavy daguerreotype from the bottom, the silvered plate cold against his thumb. As the angle caught the light, a face flickered into view. A man from 1924, wearing a stiff collar and a familiar, haunting expression. Elias traced the jagged line snaking across the man's left cheek. It matched the ridge of scar tissue beneath his own jaw, a remnant of a car wreck his mother claimed happened when he was 3. He set the image beside his open medical folder. The paper crinkled under his touch, smelling of sterile offices and old ink. His fingers trembled while he flipped through his grandfather's handwritten journals. On page 42, a dated entry described a summer gala in 1924, detailing a specific surgical recovery. Elias slid his own radiology report closer. The bone density readings and surgical staples listed in the 2022 scan mirrored the handwritten notes from a century prior, down to the millimeter. "This isn't possible," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the insulated attic walls. His pulse thudded in his ears, a rhythmic hammer against his temples. He gripped the edge of the wooden crate until the splinters bit into his skin. The ink in the journal remained dark, sharp, and undeniable. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the raised welt of the scar. It throbbed with a phantom heat. The timeline collapsed in his mind, leaving a void where his identity used to rest. He wasn't a grandson. He was a duplicate. He stared at the silver plate until the man in the photograph seemed to blink. The attic floorboards groaned under a heavy, deliberate weight. Elias didn't need to look up to know who was standing at the top of the stairs. The scent of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, chemical tang of hand sanitizer preceded his brother like a physical wall. Thomas Thorne stepped into the pool of dim light, his charcoal suit looking almost black in the shadows. He didn't lean against the rafters. He stood perfectly straight, his silver signet ring catching the flashlight's beam as he twisted it with a rhythmic, aggressive clicking sound. "The inventory is incomplete, Elias," Thomas said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the old glass window panes. "You've spent far too much time playing with the dust. Hand over the legacy plates. They are not toys for the sentimental." Elias felt his throat tighten. He looked from the 1924 image to his brother's polished shoes. "These records. Thomas, the dates don't work. The surgery in June of 2024. It's my surgery. The one I had after the wreck. How can my bones be in a book written 100 years ago?" Thomas didn't blink. He reached out a hand, palm up, expectant. "The lineage is a closed circle, not a line. You are confusing a pulse with a purpose. The plates, Elias. Now." Elias felt a surge of cold adrenaline. He didn't just see a brother, he saw a jailer. As Thomas stepped forward, his hand closing into a fist, Elias lunged. He grabbed a heavy brass lamp from a nearby side table, the metal cold and greasy with age. Thomas moved to intercept him, his fingers catching Elias's collar, the fabric tearing with a sharp, violent snap. They collided, falling back against a stack of crates. The smell of scorched dust filled the air as the lamp struck Thomas's shoulder with a dull, sickening thud. Thomas grunted, his grip loosening as he slumped against the cedar chest. Elias didn't wait. He scrambled toward the corner of the room, his fingers digging into a loose floorboard he'd marked earlier. He pulled up a leather-bound ledger, the cover slick with a dark, oily residue. He shoved it into his jacket and bolted for the narrow servants' staircase. His boots hammered against the wood. 1, 2, 3. He counted the steps, the rhythm a desperate shield against the panic rising in his chest. He burst through the back door into the humid Georgia night, the air thick with the scent of pine and impending rain. He threw himself into his old sedan, the engine turning over with a mechanical shriek that sounded like a wounded animal. He didn't look back at the looming silhouette of Blackwood Creek. He drove toward Savannah, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. The highway was a blur of gray asphalt and blank white billboards that seemed to watch him pass. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, he expected to see Thomas's headlights, but there was only the vast, swallowing dark of the forest. Savannah greeted him with a suffocating heat that turned his shirt into a second skin. He pulled up to a small, ivy-covered house on a quiet street where the Spanish moss hung like tattered lace from the oak trees. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stagnant air. He needed Sarah. He needed the woman who had always been the sane Thorne to tell him that the ledger in his lap was a hallucination. Sarah was waiting on the porch, the clink of her 42 keys providing a rhythmic, metallic greeting. She didn't ask why he was covered in attic dust or why his eyes were wide with terror. She simply held open the door, her heavy, weighted sigh deflating her chest. "You found it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The count has begun. They sat in her kitchen, the air smelling of lavender and old paper. Elias laid the ledger on the table. "Thomas tried to stop me. He talked about circles, Sarah. He talked about my life like it was a script." Sarah reached out, her charcoal-stained fingers trembling as she touched the ledger. She looked at Elias, her eyes brimming with a guilt that seemed decades old. "Elias, I need you to listen. Your first memory. The red bicycle at the park when you were 4. Do you remember the smell of the grass?" "Yes," Elias said, his brow furrowed. "And the way the bell sounded?" "No," Sarah whispered, pulling a stack of yellowed photographs from her apron pocket. She flipped one over. On the back, in precise, elegant handwriting, were the words, "Red bicycle, freshly cut grass, high-pitched bell. Memory implanted July 12th. You didn't live those years, Elias. You were grown in a vat in the basement of Blackwood Creek. We read those captions to you while you slept. We built you out of stories and old bones." The world tilted. Elias felt a phantom itch behind his ribs, a sensation of something cold and ancient shifting beneath his skin. His identity, his very soul, felt like a borrowed coat that was suddenly being unzipped. He looked at his hands, and for a fleeting second, he thought he could see the wood grain of the table through his palm. Subverted beat 2.1. Elias stared at his hands, his breath hitching in a throat that suddenly felt like it was made of dry parchment. In the harsh morning light, filtering through Sarah's kitchen window, the skin of his fingers looked thin, not just pale, but translucent, like frosted glass. He could see the faint, blue outlines of his veins. But they weren't pulsing. They looked like static lines on a television screen. "I have to stop this," he gasped, his voice cracking. "The ledger, if this book holds the records of the vessels, if it's the blueprint for what they did to me, then destroying it has to break the link. It's the logical step. If the map is gone, the traveler can't find the destination." He grabbed a box of matches from the counter, his movements frantic but certain. He knew how stories worked. He knew that fire was the great purifier. If he burned this record of his own manufacture, he could reclaim his humanity. He stepped out onto the small stone patio, the humidity of savannah pressing against him. He placed the heavy ledger in a rusted metal fire pit and struck a match. The flame flared bright orange, a small, hopeful sun in the center of his palm. "I am not a battery," he muttered, dropping the match onto the open pages. The flame touched the paper. He expected the roar of combustion, the smell of burning wood pulp, and the sight of his past turning to ash. He felt a wave of relief wash over him as the corner of the first page began to curl. "It's working," he thought. "I'm ending it here." His shoulders dropped for the first time in days. He watched the fire grow, waiting for the catharsis of destruction. But the fire didn't spread, didn't. The flame turned a sickly, bruised purple. Instead of ash, a thick, black, oily substance began to ooze from the binding of the ledger. It bubbled and hissed, releasing a scent so foul it burned the back of his throat, a mixture of ozone, rotting meat, and wet copper. Elias recoiled, coughing as the smoke hit his lungs. The fire wasn't consuming the book. It was feeding on it. The black oil began to crawl. It didn't drip downward. It flowed upward, defying gravity, coating the pages in a shimmering obsidian film that looked like living skin. As the heat intensified, Elias felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his own chest. He looked down and screamed. A black smudge was forming on his shirt, exactly where the ledger lay in the pit. The oily substance was manifesting on his own body, seeping through the fabric, burning his skin with a freezing, unnatural cold. The ledger wasn't just a book. It was a sensory organ. By trying to burn it, he was effectively setting fire to his own nervous system. The more the flames licked at the pages, the more his vision blurred into a gray mist. He realized with a jolt of pure horror that the book wasn't the cage. It was the life support. He scrambled to grab a garden hose, dousing the pit in a desperate spray of water. The purple flames died with a shriek, leaving the ledger steaming and intact, its pages now looking like wet, bruised flesh. Elias fell to his knees, his chest heaving, the black smudge on his skin slowly fading, but leaving a permanent, dull ache behind his ribs. He hadn't broken the link. He had alerted the entity that its prey was trying to bite back. The air in the house grew heavy, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made Elias's teeth ache. He walked back inside, leaning against the doorframe for support. Sarah was standing in the hallway, her hand frozen on her ring of keys. Behind her, the large mahogany mirror that had hung in her family for generations began to groan. A hairline fracture appeared in the center of the glass, snaking outward like a spider web. With a sound like a gunshot, the mirror exploded, raining silver shards across the floor. Elias didn't move. He couldn't. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but the rhythm was wrong. He looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. The pendulum swung with a violent, erratic force, and the ticking grew louder, faster, until it matched the frantic thudding in his own ears. Every clock in the house, the kitchen timer, the bedside alarm, the wall clock, began to chime in unison, a discordant, metallic wail that drowned out Sarah's cries. "They're finding you," Sarah shouted over the noise, her voice thin and panicked. "The mirrors. They're windows for the ancestors, Elias. If they can see you, they can pull you." Elias backed away from the shattered glass, his boots crunching on the shards. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure in the air, as if the room's oxygen had been sucked out. He needed to get out. He needed to move. He bolted for the back door, running blindly into the narrow alleyway behind the house. The alley was a trap of jagged brick and rusted fire escapes. Two men stepped from the shadows, men in nondescript gray suits with faces that looked like they'd been smoothed over with putty. They didn't speak. One held a heavy lead sap, the other a length of garrote wire. James Anderson, the family's lead fixer, stepped forward, his cuticles bleeding as he picked at them with a nervous, obsessive energy. "Mr. Thorne wants you home, Elias," James said, his voice eerily calm. "You're leaking essence. You're making a mess of the schedule." Elias felt a surge of terror, but as the first man lunged, something happened. The world slowed down. The raindrops hanging from the fire escape seemed to freeze in midair. Elias moved, and his body felt weightless, a blur of gray mist and motion. He wasn't running. He was flickering. He ducked under the man's swing with a speed that defied physics. He grabbed a shard of the broken mirror that had somehow stuck to his sleeve and drove it into the fixer's arm. The man didn't bleed red. He leaked a gray, smoky vapor, his eyes widening in shock as Elias moved behind him in a heartbeat. Elias felt a cold, predatory strength flowing through his limbs, the strength of the thing inside him. He struck the second man with a backhand that sent him flying into a stack of wooden pallets, the wood splintering like matchsticks. Elias stood in the center of the alley, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His hands were nearly invisible now, the brickwork behind them showing through his skin like a faded photograph. He looked at James Anderson, who had backed away, his face pale. "Tell Thomas," Elias hissed, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together, "that the vessel is breaking, and he's going to be the one who falls through the cracks." He stumbled back into Sarah's house, slamming the door and locking it with a trembling hand. Sarah was sitting at the table, a cup of tea untouched in front of her. She looked at him, and for the first time, her expression wasn't one of pity. It was one of pure, unadulterated fear. "You don't understand what you are, do you?" she whispered. "You think you're a person being possessed. You're not. You're a battery, Elias. The Thorne fortune, the land, the influence, it's all held together by the energy of the vessels. Every 30 years, the current host is drained dry to recharge the family's accounts. If you die before the ritual, the money vanishes. If you vanish, the Thorns are wiped out. They don't want your soul. They want your juice." The realization hit him harder than the fixer's sap. He wasn't a man. He was a financial asset, a living trust fund. He looked at his translucent hands, realized the translucency wasn't a side effect. It was the drain. He was being emptied. "I can feel it," Elias said, his voice hollowing out. "The vault. It's like a magnet in the basement of Blackwood Creek. It's pulling on my marrow." "Then you have to go back," Sarah said, her voice regaining a hard edge. "You have to go back before your 30th birthday. That's the deadline. That's when the reset happens. If you're not in the vault when the sun rises on your birthday, you won't just die. You'll dissipate. You'll become the very shadows that haunt this family." Elias knew she was right. He could feel the tether tightening, a cold cord of energy stretching from his chest across the miles of Georgia highway back to the estate. He couldn't hide in Savannah. He couldn't hide anywhere. He was a homing pigeon for a monster. He drove back toward Blackwood Creek as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruisey shades of purple and gold. The air grew colder with every mile, a localized frost coating the windshield of his car. By the time he reached the gates of the estate, the world was silent, the cicadas silenced by a supernatural chill. He didn't use the gate. He didn't need to. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the iron bars. As he reached out, his hand didn't hit the metal. It slid through it, a momentary ripple of static electricity dancing across his skin. He walked through the gates, through the heavy oak doors of the mansion, and through the very walls of the hallway. He was a ghost in his own home, a phantom haunting the halls of his ancestors. He descended the stairs to the basement, the smell of silver nitrate and old chemicals growing stronger. This was the laboratory, the place where he had been brewed. Sarah had told him about the anchor plate, the original 1924 daguerreotype. If he could destroy that, the entire supernatural infrastructure would collapse. He found the vault door, a massive slab of reinforced steel. He phased through it, the cold of the metal biting into his soul. Inside, the room was filled with rows of empty filing cabinets and the faint, rhythmic dripping of a silver nitrate vat. "I expected you'd find the shortcut," a voice said. Thomas was sitting in a high-backed chair in the corner, a shotgun resting across his knees. He looked tired, his triple wash ritual having left his hands raw and bleeding. He didn't look like a master of the universe. He looked like a panicked accountant. "The anchor plate, Thomas," Elias said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "Where is it?" Thomas stood up, the shotgun leveled at Elias's chest. "You're late for the appointment, little brother. The board is getting restless. The accounts are starting to dip. We need the transfer." "There is no transfer," Elias said, stepping forward. "I'm breaking the circuit." Thomas pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the small room. The buckshot hit Elias square in the chest, the force throwing him back against the silver nitrate vat. But there was no spray of red, no shattered bone. Instead, a thick gray mist erupted from the wound, swirling in the air like cigarette smoke. Elias looked down at the gaping hole in his sweater. He could see the wall behind him through his own torso. He didn't feel pain. He felt a profound, terrifying lightness. He was losing his grip on the physical world. Subverted beat 3.5. Thomas lowered the shotgun, his face twisting into a smirk that was more of a snarl. He didn't look horrified that he'd just shot his brother. He looked vindicated. He stepped over the line of salt on the floor, approaching the flickering, mist-filled form of Elias. "You think you're being a hero, don't you?" Thomas asked, his voice dripping with a cruel, mocking pity. "The brave sacrifice. Destroy the anchor. Break the curse, save the world. It's a beautiful, stupid story. But you've forgotten one very important detail about how this family works, Elias. We don't just own the present. We own the record." Elias struggled to stand, his legs feeling like they were made of water. He reached out toward the silver nitrate vat, his fingers twitching. I'll smash the plate. I'll burn the whole place down." Thomas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Go ahead. Smash it. But before you do, let me explain the physics of what you're about to do. That plate isn't just a trophy. It's the foundation. Every memory you have, every person who knows your name, every record of your birth. It's all tied to that silver image. If you destroy the anchor, you don't just die, Elias. You trigger a temporal collapse." Elias paused, his hand inches from the heavy glass frame of the 1924 daguerreotype. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about erasure," Thomas hissed, leaning in close. "If the anchor is destroyed, the Thorne line never happened. And if the Thorne line never happened, you were never written. You won't just be dead. You will be unborn. Every student you ever taught will forget your face. Every friend you ever made will have a hole in their memory where you used to be. Sarah won't remember a nephew. The world will simply adjust. You will be a ghost that never even had the dignity of a haunting. You will be nothing. Absolute, permanent nothing. Elias felt a coldness far worse than the silver nitrate. He thought of his students. He thought of the woman he'd loved in college. He thought of the small, quiet moments of his life. The smell of rain, the taste of coffee, the feeling of the sun on his face. If he broke the plate, none of it had ever happened. He would be committing a suicide that reached back through time to kill his own history. Is that the choice? Elias whispered, his voice fading into the hum of the vault. Be your slave, or never exist at all? Exist as a thorn, Thomas corrected, or don't exist at all. There is no third option. Now, step away from the vat and let the ritual begin. We have a replacement waiting, a nameless drifter who won't be missed. You'll be comfortable, Elias. You'll live on in the shadows of the bank accounts, a silent partner in the family's success. The walls of the vault began to bleed. Not oil this time, but shadows. Long, thin fingers of darkness that reached out from the corners of the room. The entity was waking up, sensing the proximity of its meal. Elias felt the darkness touching his mind, whispering in the voice of the ancestor. Richard Thorne. Come home, little cell. Come back to the organism. Elias looked at the anchor plate. He saw the face from 1924, the man who looked just like him. He realized the scar on the man's face wasn't from a car wreck. It was a mark of the first transfer. He was looking at the original thief. Then he saw something else. In the corner of the vault, huddled behind a stack of crates, was a man. He was dirty, his clothes torn, his eyes wide with a catatonic terror. Robert Miller, the drifter, the replacement. Elias felt a spark of something that wasn't written in any Thorne ledger. It was a choice, a real, unscripted choice. He lunged, not for the plate, but for the drifter. Using his fading, semi-transparent strength, he grabbed Robert and pulled him toward the wall. Run! Elias shouted, his voice a roar of static. He pushed the man through the solid concrete, phasing him out of the vault and into the night air. Robert stumbled, his eyes clearing for a second as he looked back at the wall before he turned and bolted into the woods. Thomas screamed in rage, swinging the shotgun like a club. But Elias was already at the silver nitrate vat. He didn't just smash the plate. He grabbed a canister of gasoline he'd hidden in his jacket and doused the entire laboratory. You're erasing yourself, Thomas shrieked, lunging for him. No, Elias said, his voice steady for the first time in his life. I'm rewriting the ending. He struck a match. The explosion didn't just burn the room, it burned the history. As the flames consumed the 1924 plate, Elias felt himself dissolving. He saw his life flashing before his eyes, not as a series of implanted memories, but as a sequence of numbers. 1, 2, 3. He was subtracting himself from the equation. He felt a profound peace. The itch behind his ribs was gone. The ancestor's hum was silenced by the roar of the fire. He looked at his hands, and they were finely solid, not because he was a vessel, but because the fire was real. The pain was real. The estate incinerated in a pillar of white light that could be seen for miles. The Thorne fortune, tied to the supernatural anchor, vanished in an instant. Bank accounts zeroed out. Deeds turned to dust. The family empire, built on 100 years of theft, collapsed into a heap of ash. Months later, Sarah Miller sat in a park in Savannah. She was looking at a photo album, her fingers tracing a blank white square where a photograph used to be. She felt a phantom ache in her chest, a sense of a loss she couldn't name. She knew she had a nephew once, but she couldn't remember his face. She couldn't remember his name. A man walked past her. He was young, about 29, with deep-set eyes and a sharp jawline. He didn't have a scar on his face. He stopped for a moment, looking at the empty chair beside her, a look of brief, flickering recognition in his eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "Do I know you?" Sarah looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. I don't think so. I'm sorry." The man smiled. It was a warm, authentic smile. The smile of a man who had no past to haunt him and no future that wasn't his own to write. He looked at his hands, solid and strong in the afternoon sun. "My mistake," he said. "Have a beautiful day." He walked away, disappearing into the crowd of the living, a stranger to the world. But finally, authentically himself. The end.